And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you this evening. I'm actually very pleased to welcome our author too, because if you were here when Miss Schiff spoke about her #1 bestseller, Cleopatra, you know she's one of the best, if not the best, speakers to grace our stage. And if you don't think I'm telling the truth, you can either drop me in a pond to see if I float, or sit back and listen for yourselves, but not both. Miss Schiff began her career as an editor in the publishing business before she took up the pen to write her first book, the finalist for the Pulitzer Saint-Exupéry, followed by her second biography, Vera, Miss Vladimir Nabokov, which won the Pulitzer in 2000. These two works were followed by A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America, winner of the estimable George Washington Book Prize, and the aforementioned Cleopatra. For some inexplicable reason, her publisher thought it would be appropriate to release Miss Schiff's latest book, The Witches of Salem, 1692, last Tuesday. The eminent critic and professor Elaine Showalter, writing for the Washington Post, calls The Witches a superb account of the terror of Salem. If we take witchcraft to be an evil mania that infects a whole community, Schiff shows that it is buried in the dark unconscious of a society, a nightmare waiting to reemerge. As her title hints, the witches will always be with us, as we hope the author will join us for each new book. Please welcome Stacy Schiff.
Thank you, Andy. I'm pretty sure you would float. Just after I started work on this book, I went to see one of the great scholars of the 17th century who had written some of the best pages about Salem. I went to see him because I wanted a little bit of advice. And when I left that day, we were standing on his front porch. He added another piece nearly as an afterthought. He said, "I should probably warn you that when you work on witchcraft, strange things tend to happen to you." I pretty much forgot about that. I went on to research and write the book. I finished it kind of more or less approximately on schedule. My editor was pleased with it. And he was even more pleased when he learned that Publishers Weekly, the book industry publication, was going to run an author profile of me this summer about the book. With it, the magazine would include a full-page, full-bleed author photo, which indeed they did, and it looked like this. As you may notice, that Stacy Schiff is not I. I heard about this. I was on a train in Europe, actually taking a vacation for the first time in 4 years, and I kept getting these emails saying, "I hope you're not upset." I'm thinking, they must have just used an old photo. Why would I be upset? I look 5 years younger. And then I realized they meant not my photo, someone else's photo. I get it. So thanks to Twitter, it took approximately 90 seconds to figure out that this Stacy Schiff is the novelist Amy Stewart. I've never met her. She has a book coming out this fall, which I'll be signing afterward. I think it's a mystery, which would be really appropriate. When I asked the publisher to send this page to me so that I could show it to you tonight, I also asked for the table of contents from that issue of Publishers Weekly. I don't know if you can read this, but it announces my turn to fiction in my forthcoming novel, The Witches. You can imagine my surprise at learning that my 4 years in the archives, unearthing, deciphering, copying, squinting at documents, corralling my imagination, triple-checking details, hiring fact-checkers, was all so that I could write a novel. So indeed, strange things tend to happen to you when you work on witchcraft. The Witches is not a work of fiction. It is instead an attempt to grapple with what precisely happened in eastern Massachusetts in 1692, among the loopiest, certifiably strangest moments in American history. Salem may qualify as the best known but least understood chapter in our past, partly because it just seems so crazily improbable, and partly because it comes to us largely through Hawthorne and Arthur Miller, who in fact were writing fiction. Here we are, almost exactly halfway between Plymouth Rock and Paul Revere, and everything seems to go entirely off the rails. Salem offers several kinds of stories at once, as I'll make clear in a few minutes, And all of that in the course of 9 short months. It's a tragedy to which we go back over and over. Few corners of American history have been explored as often. And if you don't believe me, take a look at this. This is my local library's stacks on Puritan New England. I took this picture, of course, in part so you would feel sorry for me. But I did really gnaw my way down from one end to the other. Here are my office shelves when I finished the book. You'll notice that at the very top, those red and green Loeb Classical Library volumes, those are sort of the refugees from the Cleopatra years. I've always wondered what Cicero thought about being cornered by Puritans on all sides there. Salem is a little bit our national campfire tale, one of the rare moments in our history where the candles are knocked out and everyone seems to be groping around in the dark. The dark, of course, is where all good stories begin. It's in the dark that we imagine most vividly and believe most fervently. It's in the dark that we contemplate our mistakes and wrestle with our fears. In the dark, goes the Italian proverb, every cat is a leopard. And if you read the court papers of 17th century Essex County, which I did with enormous relish, you begin to notice that the New Englander lived very much, very attentively, and very anxiously in the dark. Women stumble into beds to find strangers asleep there. Men trip home through the night to discover that familiar landmarks have moved and they are lost in their own backyards. Young men report that they go weak-kneed at the thought of riding from town to their family farms after sundown. And when the devil offers to accompany them, they accept his offer. I read every 17th century account of the New England murk and of the howling wolves and the lurking Native Americans, but it took me a really long time to understand how dark really is, because of course we live in such an electrified world. And in truth, it took me until this is downtown Manhattan in 2012 in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. I was driving friends home. I live uptown where we had electricity. This was downtown where there was no power. And all of the accounts of the New England wilderness suddenly made sense to me. The 17th century dark was a really different dark. Hence the line in chapter 1 of the book, the sky over New England was crow black, pitch black, Bible black, so black it could be difficult at night to keep to the path, so black that a line of trees might freely migrate to another location, or that you might find yourself pursued after nightfall by a rabid black hog, leaving you to crawl home, bloody and disoriented, on all fours. That's actually from a piece of court testimony from a man testifying against a woman whom he accused of witchcraft. The basic Salem facts are simple. In early 1692, over a particularly harsh winter, a 9 and an 11-year-old girl began to shudder and scream. They happened to have been the niece and the daughter of the Salem village minister, Samuel Parris. Here he is. This is probably painted just before the move to Salem, when Parris would have been in his late 30s. The cousins complained that something bit them and choked them. Their bodies twisted. They attempted to fly through the air. They lunged into fireplaces. One of them disappeared halfway down a well. It took to interrupting ministers in the middle of sermons. We have numerous descriptions of the girl's symptoms, but of course we have no image. This is the closest really that we can come. This is from a 19th century French text on the phases of hysteria, on emotional trauma and what its physical symptoms looked like. And pretty much all of the accounts of the Salem girls talk about the arched back like that and the pretzeled limbs and the arms gone rigid. Remember that no one in the 17th century distinguished between an overtaxed nervous system and bewitchment. And nor, for that record, did anyone distinguish between diabolical collusion and a guilty conscience. Instead, the first question that anyone asked in the face of these kinds of symptoms was, and for a long time really would remain, am I bewitched? Prolonged fits were understood to be sent by the devil. And within a matter of weeks, 2 other village girls also began to convulse. All of them soon learned from parents or from local authorities, including Reverend Parris, that they were bewitched. And of course, with that diagnosis, you can imagine what happened. The girls' symptoms deteriorated. Soon enough, all of the 4 began to talk about who was bewitching them. We don't know why they named the names they initially did, but think about it for a second. To the question, who annoys you, who unsettles you, who wishes you ill, Each of us has an answer. No, you don't have to tell me who you're thinking of. And so did the girls. The answer to that question in 1692 was clear. It turned out that there were not one but 3 witches flying around Salem village, and warrants went out at the end of February for their arrest. The suspects immediately appeared before the authorities. Justice was very swift at this time, and the authorities interrogated them in the manner of the day, which meant that a local beggar woman, the first woman to be deposed, was asked when she had signed a contract with the devil, why she hurt the girls, and what creatures she had dispatched to help her do so. Those questions came to her from well-dressed, important men who owned significant businesses, who spoke with weight and authority. The contest was asymmetric. I should say that this story has something for everyone, and here you can see it begins to mutate. If it begins as a fairy tale, once upon a time a wicked witch cast a spell on 2 little girls, it very quickly turns into a courtroom drama. Let me talk for just a few minutes about how witchcraft worked, because it's important to know what exactly a 17th century New Englander believed a witch was. Not everyone was clear on that subject, but those who were clear were exceedingly clear. To the early American, a witch existed as plainly as did heat or light. As one authority had it, it was as obvious that a spirit could carry men and women through the air as it was that the wind could flatten a house. And the early American witch, I should add, did not look like this, although there is something of the Wizard of Oz in the Salem story. There's actually quite a bit of it, about which I'll talk in a few minutes. And nor did the 17th century witch look like this. This is actually the original Wicked Witch from the Wizard of Oz, from the 1900 edition of the book. I particularly like that flying pigtail, or braid, I guess it is, with the bow, and the utterly unexpected spats on the feet. It's really quite the get-up here. This, for the record, is one of the first American Halloween witches. And you'll notice that she hasn't yet been converted to basic black. The basic black wardrobe seems to have returned after Margaret Hamilton in the 1939 movie. The witch, as a 17th century New Englander knew her, was someone who could perform unnatural feats by virtue of the contract that she had signed with the devil. And from that pact, she drew the power to turn herself into a cat, a wolf, a rabbit, or a rabid black hog. She could be a man or a woman, although she was more often female. She maintained a menagerie of imps or familiars who did her bidding, and those mascots could be turtles or weasels. Cats, dogs, and toads were prevalent. As you can see here, this is a 17th century English witch who's feeding blood to her diabolical toads. This is a woman with her great black cat as her familiar, and with her demon familiar as well. This is also English 17th century. And this woman was in fact acquitted. This illustrates a witchcraft case from 1621. This woman was acquitted of all charges. These are some more diabolical familiars, and you can see that they run the gamut from your standard issue barnyard animal to sort of gargoyle-like fantastical creatures. These are some more. Black cats were particular favorites. They turn up regularly throughout the Salem testimony. There are a lot of black cats in this story. Since antiquity, they've enjoyed an association with the devil. Black dogs turn up as well, though historically English witches tended to prefer feline to canine form. This, by the way, is not a witch's familiar. This is our family cat, Moose, who I hope is looking a little bit demonic in this picture. Cats tended to slip in and out, and I did have the black cat before I started the book. So, cats tended to slip in and out of small spaces, to appear when least expected, often in beds where we feel most vulnerable, just as witches were suddenly flitting everywhere around 1692 Salem. A witch signed her diabolical contract in blood. She enchanted with ointments and effigies. She could be a muttering, contentious malcontent, or she or he could be inexplicably strong or unaccountably smart. Both kinds of witches would turn up in 1692, as would wealthy merchants who were witches, sea captains who were witches, ministers, and homeless 5-year-old girls who were witches. While her power was supernatural, the witch's crime was religious. In New England, her target was the soul rather than the body. And her connection to the convulsing Salem girls? Every Englishman had long known what enchantment looked like. According to the legal guide on many Salem desks, and which was about to land on Reverend Parris's desk, this is the volume by theologian William Perkins, witchcraft manifested as senseless trances, paralyzed limbs, convulsions, jaws clamped shut, frothing, gnashing, and violent shaking. In other words, the symptoms of the parsonage girls to a T. When Massachusetts establishes a legal code, the first capital crime is idolatry. The second was witchcraft. In the years since those laws had been codified, New England had indicted about 100 witches, a quarter of them men. Massachusetts, however, had only hanged 6. Beside the mystery of the symptoms in Salem is another arguably greater mystery: why in 1692 the hasty and merciless prosecution? The charges were familiar from earlier cases. Casting spells on livestock was a fairly common charge. In Salem, witches cast spells on cattle, on hay, on wagons, and on muskets. They enchanted fireplaces. They sent dishes sailing through the air. This woodcut is from an early English case. These accused women did not fare well. Why are they riding on a pig here? Because they've been accused of pig bewitching. New England witches tended to do a great deal of flying down chimneys and through apple trees, and ultimately to a diabolical Sabbath, but I should say that traditionally the English witch did not fly. Continental witches, however, did, which would provide a significant clue as to what was going to happen in Salem. While before 1692, there had been witches in New England, none of them had ever flown, nor had there been ghosts, which also flit around the Salem courtroom for the first time. Most, but not all of them, are women who've come back from the dead to avenge themselves on an abusive husband. Those who confess to witchcraft will mention having flown, I should add, on the devil's shoulders, or on poles, or on branches, or on sticks. No one, alas, flies on a broom. These are my favorite flyers. This is a sort of time-lapse photo, if you can see the witches flying up the chimney, but this is from France a century earlier. And again, you can't tell if this is a broom or a pole. These are some English flyers who seem to be recruiting the woman on the ground, but this woodcut comes later. It's 18th century. As far as broomsticks go, this one is my favorite. Leave it to a French witch to be able to fly gracefully. This is 15th century, by the way. The accepted logic on the phenomenon went like this: witches existed in all times and places. How was it possible that imagination, which is so personal and predictable, could deliver the same conceit across cultures in all eras? In other words, witchcraft was so preposterous, so improbable, it had to be true. You couldn't make this stuff up. The first suspects surprised no one. They counted among the likeliest people to be voted off the island. So let me talk for just a few minutes about the next one, about the fourth accused witch, for a couple of reasons. I think part of what fascinates us about Salem is the seeming randomness of the accusations. What if the next knock were to land on your door? And in the case of Martha Corey, the stiff-spined, pious farm woman in her 60s, we know precisely what happened when that knock came about mid-afternoon on March 12th. Her name was first uttered by a 12-year-old village girl, and it surprised everyone. Because it did, Corey's church deacon and another villager paid a courtesy call on her to talk to her about what was happening. But first they stopped off to see the little girl. Could she possibly be mistaken? Could she describe the clothes of the witch that tormented her? She couldn't, she said, because the witch had also that morning temporarily blinded her. The men rode off. They found Martha Corey at home. She welcomed them with a smile. She also anticipated their question. "I know what you are come for," she said. "You are come to talk with me about being a witch." She was not a witch, she said. She could not help people gossiping about her. How do we know all this, by the way? Because the two men later wrote out a deposition. I definitely am showing you this to make you feel sorry for me. This is what I've been reading. When her callers revealed that a bewitched girl had named her, Corey was prepared. "But does she tell you what clothes I have on?" she asked. The callers were flabbergasted by the question, which they asked her to repeat. She seemed to have some supernatural knowledge of what they were going to talk about. She assured them she had no cause for concern. As everyone knew, she was a deeply devout woman, a little given even to lecturing. She wasn't surprised if the devil had recruited the first 3 women accused. In her estimation, they were idle, slothful people. An interesting thing about Salem is that even those who believe themselves to be innocent think the others to be witches. Nearly everyone seemed to believe that some kind of sorcery was at work. They just didn't think that they were the guilty parties. Martha Corey that afternoon promised to open the eyes of the magistrates and the ministers so they could locate the real witches, another comment, of course, that would backfire. Within the week, not only her 12-year-old accuser, but that girl's mother was also afflicted. A spectral Corey nearly tore the older woman to shreds, offering her a diabolical pact to sign. A warrant for Corey's arrest went out immediately. This is it. In it, Corey stood accused of having committed sundry acts of witchcraft on a grown woman and on 4 youngsters, one of them Reverend Parris's 12-year-old niece. That note at the bottom in black, by the way, is the Salem constable's confirmation that he has Martha Corey in custody. It's dated March 21st. The warrant had gone out 2 days earlier, but as it happened, March 19th was a Saturday. And because of the Sabbath the next day, she couldn't be immediately apprehended. That left her time to attend meeting on Sunday alongside her accusers. So before the pulpit that day, you have 5 spellbound girls and women and 1 witch suspect. All of them stood in close proximity in a tiny building which measures 34 by 28 feet. This is a reconstruction of the Salem Meeting House. And you can see how dark it would have been inside. It wasn't always possible to identify the suspects indoors. Sometimes they had to be led outdoors into the daylight. The minister began the service to be interrupted by the girls in the pews. They demanded that he name his text, complaining that it was too long. One of them pointed to the rafters. She could see Martha Corey sitting not in the pews, but in the beams with her diabolical canary. The next day, Martha Corey returned to the same room to defend herself before 2 justices. It was thronged with spectators. There was a palpable sense of terror in the air. A visiting minister said he could nearly make out the hammering hearts, the raised hairs on the back of the neck. Before the justices, Corey insisted on her innocence. One asked the question that gnawed at everyone's minds: how had she known she was going to be asked about her clothing? She tried to explain, but she was interrupted. Generally, 17th century courtrooms were not orderly places. The girls frantically pointed out the devil in the room, whispering in Martha Corey's ear. "What did he say to you?" asked the justice. She had neither seen nor heard a thing. "We must not believe all that these distracted children say," she answered, eliciting fresh agonies. "Did she understand the meaning of distracted?" countered the justice. She'd used the word several times. By definition, distraction is fleeting. The girls, however, were utterly consistent. Everyone, he reminded her, understood them to be bewitched. Repeatedly, he urges her to confess. She will not. One of the interesting things about the Salem, I should point out, is that those who refuse to confess will be the ones to hang. Those who confess are spared for various reasons, which is to say that the noblest, the most defiant, the most principled will fare the least well. Corey is pelted with questions, none of which she could properly answer. Instead, she posed a particularly plaintive query herself. "Can an innocent person," she asked, "be guilty?" You can't read it, but this is the account of her hearing session, and the magistrate's first lines here are, "You are now in the hands of authority. Tell me now why you hurt these persons." And Corey answers, "I do not," and then asks if she can pray, a request that is denied several times over. She insisted she had nothing to do with witchcraft, a statement that incenses the crowd. The girls began to yelp and snap and mock her replies. When she bit her lip with nervousness, teeth marks bloomed on the arms of her accusers, and if she clasped her hands together, the girls shuddered. If she leaned forward, they crumpled over in agony. It seemed as if she were working her witchcraft in the courtroom itself. By this time, 2 adult women were bewitched. In the course of Corey's testimony, one of them, a 40-year-old woman, begins to howl in pain, and then she throws her muff across the courtroom at Corey. It fails to hit her, so the woman bends down and removes a shoe, which she throws, and hits Martha Corey squarely in the head. A pin that she had stuck in one of her victims will turn up in the child's hair. These, by the way, are some pins that were evidently preserved from the Salem courtroom. Over the next week, they would be found sticking out of the girl's legs and hands. One girl turns up with a pin puncturing her lips together so that she is unable to testify. The bewitched suffer all kinds of agonies in the courtroom. Their blood trickles from one girl's mouth. A red stain appears across her bonnet. and another found her hands bound inextricably together. How do we know all of this? From two sources. A former village minister was on hand that day, and he published his rather wide-eyed account of the trial in April. Here's the title page, and you can imagine what this narrative did in terms of symptoms. It did nothing to alleviate the witchcraft. And we have a great deal of paperwork from the hearing. This is the deposition of one of Martha Corey's accusers, a 17-year-old girl named Elizabeth Hubbard. Corey, it seemed, had urged her to sign a pact with the devil. She'd bitten, choked, and pinched her. The girl displayed her bruises to the courtroom. I believe in my heart that Martha Corey is a dreadful witch, the teenager swears. Words that, as you can see from the ink here, were added later. You'll see that there are a couple of kinds of ink. The court testimony, I should probably say, is not infrequently edited or expanded upon after the fact. This is a deposition in Samuel Parris's hand. It's his and a local innkeeper's deposition against Martha Corey for having tortured the girls at the hearing. And you'll see that Parris seems to have written in those second and third lines afterwards, after he'd asked his neighbor to affix his name in the third line. Martha Corey went that day to jail. She spends the next 6 months in chains awaiting her trial. 6 days after her hearing, her minister delivered this sermon, also in the same meeting house. And when I mention documentation, by the way, this is as good as it gets. This is Samuel Parris's. Parris is an extremely fastidious man and has the most meticulous handwriting. This is his March 27th sermon. Christ knows how many devils there are in his churches and who they are. It's a finger-pointing sermon, as you might surmise. You can imagine precisely what happened next. People began to remember things they couldn't explain, often decades-old things they couldn't explain. Men began to see their neighbors flying through the streets. One wrestled with a black goblin in his parlor. The evening after the first hearing, 2 villagers met an unnatural beast on the ground, which dissolved in the moonlight. 2 or 3 women, they later testified, materialized in its place and flew swiftly away. Shortly thereafter, behind locked doors, one of the men sat up in bed when a great gleam and a fat gray cat appeared in his room. If this has happened to any of you recently, I would love it if you would talk to me afterwards. All of this testimony is sworn on oath. It's also full of tall tales, unless you happen to believe, as one woman reported, having vowed to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, that she flew on a stick with her church deacon and 2 others to a satanic baptism, and that the previous Monday she carried her minister's specter through the air with her, having previously conferred in her orchard with a satanic cat. Again and again, while working on this book, I thought of Dumbledore in the 7th Harry Potter book. Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean it's not real? The first case came to trial in June, and the first suspect hanged a week later, protesting to the end that she was innocent. Events moved quickly, arrests and afflictions multiplied. It was a plague involving 100 witches, a number that grew to 307 and later to 500. Here's where the courtroom drama mutates again, only this time into a horror story, not only for those who spent months roasting and starving in airless, fetid prisons. Some suspects would die there, others would give birth there. What begins to emerge from the later testimony are details, though, of a diabolical pact. It seems that the witches have a ringleader. He's a minister who's arrested in May, and they're intent on a rather grandiose conspiracy. This is also in New England first. Beginning in Salem Village, the witches intend to destroy every church in Massachusetts Bay, and while they're at it, they intend to subvert the government, too. By late July, the authorities had pieced all of this tale together, the diabolical Sabbath to which witches flew from all over, from as far away as Connecticut, on all kinds of conveyances, often 3 or 4 to a pole, to land in Salem Village. According to Parris's daughter, by the way, Martha Corey does attend that diabolical meeting. You can reconstruct this from about 50 pieces of testimony that we have from the hearings, but alas, we have no image of it. Here, though, is a 17th century engraving of a German witch's Sabbath. It's a much more decadent, much lusher production, but certain themes are similar to what the Salem villagers will describe. You'll remember that I said there'd been no flying in Massachusetts before 1692. Well, suddenly everyone in Essex County seems to be aloft. Here's an illustration of 22 years earlier. This is from a Swedish witchcraft epidemic. And from the book, you'll see why Sweden plays an enormously important role in what happens in Salem. But notice here that the woman is flying with her own children. Massachusetts girls of 8 or 9 accuse their mothers of coercing them to sign pacts with the devil. In what I think is one of the most chilling scenes in the book, you have a teenager accusing her mother and her grandmother in court of having given her to the devil, and all 3 generations end up convicted. Indeed, by late summer, denunciations flew in every direction. Daughters accused mothers, brothers accused sisters, parishioners accused ministers. In Andover, nearly 1 in 10 people was accused, including nearly every female family member of the town's senior minister. Servants accused mistresses, although mistresses did not accuse servants. And no one seemed ever to suffer afflictions without also being able to name a witch. Were you likely to be accused? Yes, in particular if you were inexplicably strong or unaccountably smart. Martha Corey went to her death on September 22nd in what would be the last hanging. Before she hangs, she's visited in prison by Reverend Parris, who will excommunicate her in prison. This is the account that he writes up of the excommunication visit. He's very irritated that his prisoner, she's a very religious woman, you'll remember, refuses to pray with him. In the 17th century, a prisoner paid for his own hay and his blankets and his provisions in prison. This is an accounting from the Salem jail keep. And the 3rd entry here, if you can see, for Giles Corey and his wife, is for the Coreys. By September, the colony had executed 14 women, 5 men, and 2 dogs for witchcraft. Somewhere between 140 and 180 had been accused. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the witch panic was over. The questions that Salem elicits are those of our nightmares. Can an innocent person be guilty, Martha Corey had asked. Might I be a witch and not know it, asked another suspect. Could anyone, wondered a group of men late in the summer, think himself safe? A brash widow in her 50s came before the justices in April. She was not a witch. She couldn't even say what a witch was, but she had the bad luck to be appearing before a master logician. How can you know that you are not a witch and yet not know what a witch is? He asked. So obviously what we have on our hands is not entirely a fairy tale or a courtroom drama or a horror story, but a thriller. Presumably the line of trees did not migrate from one side of the field to the other. Presumably there were no flights through the air or killer cats. Presumably no witch stuck pins in those girls, and presumably there was no satanic celebration with a long banquet table and tankards in the Salem meadow. How then did these things seem to happen? When you pry the whole episode apart, you begin to see that it makes uncanny, eminently modern sense. And no, I'm not going to tell you how that came to pass. The clues to what drives Salem forward, what results in an unprecedented 100% conviction rate for the only witchcraft panic in American history, are woven a strand at a time into each chapter of the book. The story is a thriller, and the book is really meant to read like one. It's meant to unspool with the logic of a dream and the lucidity of the supernatural. The unlikeliest of heroes emerge in the end, and no, I'm not going to tell you who they were either, because that would make my publisher very unhappy. We go back to Salem again and again for the same reason that it came to happen in the first place, that irksome lack of closure. We share the villagers' itch for resolution. We go back to the trials for another reason, too. As crack-ups go, this one counts among the more sensational in our history, to which so many later missteps would be compared. That's less on account of its scale as its circumstances. The court in 1692 consisted of the best and the brightest. They lived in the finest mansions and gabled homes in their respective communities. In 1692, it's the state, in the broad light of day, in the name of God, led by the ablest men in the colony, who will send innocent people to their deaths. When friends and acquaintances came before the authorities doubted not the girls but their own friends. This is Chief Justice William Stoughton, who headed the court, and I will give you one hint and tell you he is not the hero of the story. He was every bit as starchy as he looks here. He's the most eminent of New England legal authorities. He also will die at home 9 years after the trials without a word of regret or apology for what had happened in 1692. He was the go-to person for legal questions in 17th century Massachusetts, no one was better versed in legal code, which points up something else crucial about the panic. Erudition plays much more of a role than ignorance in this story. The Bay Colony arguably qualified as the best educated community in the history of the world until that time. The New England ministers, and here our increase in Cotton Mather, the father and son so central to the story, the New England ministers, to whom any number of civic authorities appealed, had delved deeply into the literature. They had devoured libraries on the subject of witchcraft. If anything, they might have read a little bit too much. Today, of course, the trials endure as a sort of moral guardrail. This is where Salem mutates yet again to become a cautionary tale. They stop us when we overcorrect or overreact, when fear overpowers reason. They make the experts seem less expert. They remind us of the risk of thinking ourselves exceptional. Where will the devil show most malice but where he's hated and hated most, Cotton Mather had asked. Satan's appearance in Massachusetts seemed nearly to be a badge of honor, further proof that New Englanders were the chosen people. And that statement resonates. In troubled times, we look naturally for traitors, for terrorists, for secret agents. They hate us for our freedoms. I just want to add that Salem feels deeply, eerily familiar to me in an age of crowdsourced stories and public shaming. An oral culture is remarkably similar to an internet culture. Both feed on indelible rumor and neither has much use for truth. The internet, too, turns out to be a brilliant tool for sowing conspiracy theories. There's no better way to broadcast a zombie apocalypse. Things went viral in the 17th century, too. And we, too, can be two places now at once in the real world and once as our virtual selves, just as Martha Corey was simultaneously at home minding her own business and at the neighbors pummeling and choking the children. That virality was not something that I saw at the outset, nor did I grasp how very much Salem resembles a fairy tale. At its heart, there are sexual undercurrents and raw terror. It's about what we see when we close our eyes and about how that image evolves. Sometimes these images tend to mutate from one thing into another. The incident touches on what's unreal, but by no means untrue. For everyone concerned, Salem's a story of one thing that's really about something else altogether. I don't know how this got in here, but this is one of my many file drawers, which just tells you how many people had different agendas, all of them hidden, and all of which will tend to lock together to make these events take place. Those are the things that truly unsettle us, just as they unsettled the 17th century New Englander who met with the hearthside goblin or the rabid pig. Out of reasons, the early American turned for an explanation to witchcraft. And out of reasons, you're of course supposed to turn to a book. It's called The Witches, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you. Okay, great.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming this evening. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Wait for me to call on you, and we'll get a mic to you right here in the first row, and then in the third row here.
Was there any evidence of ergot?
That's the theory that won't die. There's a wonderful theory from the 1970s, I think from 1976, that ergot poisoning had caused the hallucinations from which the girls suffer. This would have been the idea that the grain supply, that the rye supply had fermented, and that anyone who ingested it began to hallucinate. And it was a terrifically good theory at explaining things like rabid black pigs and what sounds like a low-grade acid trip colony-wide, until it was pointed out that there were several inconsistencies with it. One is that only some members of the family seem to be affected. So why, for example, in the Parris household, would two of the girls have had this problem, but not the other three children? The girls were inconsistent even in their suffering. They could choke and convulse at one moment and be perfectly well behaved the next, which also leads to a question about the ergot poisoning. Also, apparently it was the wrong time of year for this to have taken place. And if you look at it, I guess I should also add, the descriptions of what they see are straight out of the Puritan playbook in terms of diabolical imagery. It's not like they're it's not like they're freely hallucinating, they are hallucinating in biblical imagery. So that also would seem suspect. The lovely thing about that theory, other than its just sheer elegance, is that it makes no one accountable. If we could blame this on simple fermentation, then there is nobody here with any blood on his hands.
Yeah, gentleman off to our left.
A while back in college, I took a course on early Salem and New England, and a couple of things we covered was Cotton Mather, and he was sinners in the hands of an angry God. Showed a little lack of humor and that such in Salem. And we covered one witch case, and the case was basically a woman who was describing several injuries she had received, and which injuries seemed to indicate a little she was a married woman, and the injuries seemed to indicate a little extramarital activities on the woman's part, which he attributed to witchcraft. And I guess my question would be, was there cases like this where people indulging in that kind of activity or other activity were using the witches as a scapegoat to escape, the real situation?
One of my favorite bits of research, the self-indulgent part for me, was reading the 9 volumes of, this will tell you something about the perversity of my character, the records and files of the quarterly courts of Essex County, which is a roundup of all the civil and criminal court cases of 20 years preceding 1692. There was an incredible amount of fornication in eastern Massachusetts. Debt, drunkenness, trespass. I mean, it's like the list of abominations. Yes, there are an extraordinary number of illegitimate children, and there's a lot of adultery, in fact. I don't know that case that you're referring to, in fact. It's really, if you go back to the records and you try to piece together why certain people were accused, in some cases you can see that there were land disputes. In some places you can see there was unrequited love. In some places you can pretty much get a glimpse of envy. But in many cases it's speculative. We don't know why certain people were accused. What we do know is that after a certain point in the summer, when people begin to freely confess to witchcraft, one of the first 3 suspects confesses, as I think I said, and then the confessions by midsummer begin to come fast and furious. And everyone who confesses seems to be able to find, not surprisingly, a stain on his or her conscience. So in confessing to diabolical collusion, what will come out is often an adulterous liaison, or an abortion, or a bout of drinking, or a woman's convinced that she murdered her child because the child fell down a well. So there's an enormous amount of guilt, obviously, that's being discharged here.
More questions. Gentleman in green here, and then about 5 rows back.
Hi. I'm a direct descendant of Rebecca Nurse, who was hanged, and who was at the time in her late 70s. So, it's funny how sometimes it hit lots of different people for very, very strange reasons. And I've been to the place where she's buried, and she was reburied later in a family plot.
2 things I want to just say. First of all, I think I've met half your family in the last week. You have a lovely family. Is all of New England descended from Rebecca Nurse? I spent a lot of time on Rebecca Nurse in the book. One of the difficult decisions in putting this narrative together, you have 20 innocent people who die, 19 who hang, and 1 who's crushed. Which to include and which not to include. And Rebecca Nurse has been much written about, but I realized I had to talk about her for a couple of reasons that are remarkable. One is that your family, the Nurse family, are one of the few families that do not turn upon each other. They are steadfast, they are solid. I mean, it's almost chilling their nobility in the face of this accusation. They do not point fingers at each other. They do not turn each other in. 3 sisters are accused, Rebecca Nurse and her 2 sisters. It does seem in their case to be a long-standing, like 40 to 50-year-old property dispute that has resulted in these accusations. The family stands together, and they repeatedly petition the courts. In most cases where anyone tried to stand defiantly against the court, they too were accused. And in the case of Rebecca Nurse's husband, for whatever reason, no one dares accuse him. Rebecca Nurse is actually not, she's declared innocent. She's the only person for whom the jury returns an innocent verdict, which Stoughton doesn't accept. And he makes them go back and redeliberate until they come back with a guilty verdict. And to me, it was horrible to write this part of the book, but it said so much about how these cases were prosecuted and what the justices were looking for. Then the family appeals to the governor, who's a newly installed governor, for a reprieve, and the reprieve is issued, and somebody, presumably Stoughton, manages to get that overturned too. So the drama, the trauma that the family must have felt at twice feeling that they had actually freed her from this indignity, and then both times been defeated, must have been extraordinary. And yes, she does go to her death.
There's a fellow in the fourth row here, and then we'll head all the way back.
Can you tell us what accounts for the origin and the persistence of the myth that they were burned at the stake rather than hanged?
That's the other myth that won't die. I think most of us think that this was these were all women accused by men, all of whom burn, three things which are untrue. I think that dates from actually the Civil War years, when the South was pretty much fed up with being raked over the coals for its slaveholding by the North, and so decided to fire back with the easiest volley they could. You might accuse us of slaveholding, but at least we didn't burn witches. And there's a lot of this very inflamed rhetoric in the 1860s. And I'm pretty sure that that's what stuck. And also, burning witches is what happened in Europe. So the image of burning women at the stake, which is a pretty difficult thing to unthink, obviously inserts itself into the story here. But I think it's a leftover of those years of the North and South lobbing accusations back at each other. Salem is used as a very effective means of pretty much wiping the Puritans out of the history for a little while. The Puritans exit stage left, the Pilgrims enter, and then the Puritans get rehabilitated later because the Pilgrims didn't persecute people. The Puritans had a somewhat more difficult reputation.
Yeah, all the way back there.
You mentioned early in your fascinating talk a case in England in which a man was acquitted of being witch.
Marcia, could you repeat the question a little
Yes.
louder, please?
Sorry.
You mentioned early in your fascinating talk a case in England in which a man was acquitted, and it seems pretty extraordinary given how easy it was to be convicted. Could you talk a little about the acquittal and how common that was or uncommon?
There is no acquittal in 1692. It's 100% conviction rate. So if you came to trial in 1692, there is essentially no hope for you. And that's a New England first. There had never been this kind of merciless, ruthless prosecution before. Part of what begins to spur the confessions, which pretty much take off midsummer, is the realization that people who confess, who give the court what they want, which is to say names and more information about these diabolical happenings, go back to prison, but they don't seem to hang. So there's an added incentive to confess rather than to stand steadfast and insist on your own innocence, as Rebecca Nurse did. No one who confesses will go to the gallows.
Yes, there's another gentleman all the way back there. Maybe while we're getting to him, can you talk about whether there were 18th and 19th century representations in this country of this topic that also bloomed, and were any of them satirical?
I don't know if any of them were satirical. If anyone pokes fun at the witchcraft, you mean. There is an enormous silence after Salem. Maybe in the South, which I've never actually looked at. There's a terrific silence after Salem in talking about it. There's nothing in terms of illustrative material, obviously. 1692, in terms of records, disappears completely. The court records are gone. We don't know what happened to them. We have hearing records, which were the preliminary hearings. We don't have the court records. The year vanishes from people's diaries. The minister's sermons from that year are no longer extant, even though we have 1691 and 1693. Correspondences are missing from that year as well. So there's this strange silence that descends. It's a very long time before the town of Salem will even begin to confront its past. There's a wonderful Philadelphia Inquirer headline from, I think, 1897 about how the people of Salem refused to talk about the witchcraft. In the South, that may be less true. I don't know. I've never looked into it before.
Just curious. Yeah, all the way in back.
So can you characterize what the trial would have looked like? I mean, did the person have representation? And if so, was there ever a logician that could, fight against the anti-logic? And what happened to them if there was?
That's a great question. The 17th century courtroom, or as a legal expert said to me when I was quizzing him about these kinds of things, there's a reason why we say order in the court today. The 17th century courtroom was a circus, was a raucous, boisterous place. Everyone is speaking at once. It's incredibly chaotic. A lot of the times, court reporters will have trouble hearing the testimony in order to take it down. Samuel Parris at a couple of points says, I couldn't hear the testimony. People are allowed to call things out in accusing the suspect. Hearsay is perfectly admissible. No one advocates for the accused for two reasons. One is there are no lawyers in America yet. And in fact, earlier there's a wonderful letter that goes to London saying, could you please send us some honest lawyers if such a thing exists in nature? The Attorney General for the trials is an English-trained attorney. Otherwise, the men on the Witchcraft Court are all exceedingly well educated, but including Stoughton, do not have legal degrees. A suspect does not swear her testimony on oath, whereas those who oppose her do, so that their word seems to carry greater weight. And although she is in theory allowed, or he is allowed to question the jurors to decide which jurors should be seated, only George Burroughs, who's the minister I mentioned, seems to have exercised that right to question which jurors were going to sit on the panel. We don't know how the jurors delivered their verdict, if the foreman, we know there's a foreman, if the foreman stood or how it's delivered. And it seems from the accounts we have as if the Chief Justice exercised a great deal of control over the questioning and over the room. Just by virtue of being there, though, your guilt was somewhat assumed.
Yeah, gentleman about 8 rows back.
How widely publicized was this contemporaneously throughout the colonies?
When I started this, I thought there must be terrific material in the archives of New York, for example. The other colonies must have been looking at the Puritans thinking, what are these loopy people doing? And, mocking them or at least following this because it's such a scandalous story. There's it's very thin evidence to go on. A few of the well-off suspects will manage to break out of prison and escape to New York. The relations between New York and Massachusetts at this point are very hostile, so New York is very happy to welcome them. But we don't know what New Yorkers made of what was happening in Massachusetts. We only know that they were open-minded enough to believe these people were not witches. There are a few letters from Quakers. Remember that the Puritans had persecuted Quakers, basically rubbing their hands at the idea that now the Puritans were hanging each other rather than Quakers. So there is a certain kind of mirthful, gallows humor about, now look what they're doing to each other. And there's actually one of the best uses afterwards of, one of the best mockeries of what has happened to the courts afterwards is by a Salem town Quaker who is essentially convicted of writing a book criticizing the state, something one could never have done before 1692. It's a wonderful case, Thomas Mall. And when he's brought into court for this scandalous book that he's written and had printed outside the colony, he basically says to the jury, speaks to your question about how a court worked, don't make the same mistake that those other jurors did. They have this on their consciences. You don't want to be pushed around by the justices. But also, how can you be certain that my name on that book is the same person as the man who stands before you, any more than you could be certain that Martha Corey was the same as her specter? And he gets off. Because everyone is in such shock still at making this kind of a mistake. But otherwise, there's very little, at least that I could find. And London doesn't find out what's happening until the trials are essentially over, until the first letter to London goes out in October, at which point the Witchcraft Court has almost been shut down.
I have a question on your writing process. How did you come to choose to write about the Salem witch trials as opposed to any other topic?
I'm from Massachusetts, so I maybe didn't ever outgrow my witchcraft phase. It was pointed out to me after, this is not the direct answer, but the oblique answer to your question, only after I finished did someone point out to me that I had been living with an adolescent girl the entire time I was working on this book. Which is, if it's not about adolescence, I don't know what it's about. I mean, it's about the colony's adolescence, it's about the afflicted girl's adolescence, it's about Cotton Mather's adolescence, it's about adolescence on every possible level, and how, you know, an unruly youngster deals with a clueless older person. That would be I. So I came to it through two different things of which I am more aware. One was this feeling after Cleopatra that I had more to say or more to investigate about women's voices and how they get smothered and how they morph into things they're not. How have we turned this story about girls who are clearly in danger or suffering from something into a story about perilous, witchy women? You know, how did that happen? Why did they have so much trouble saying what they had to say? And why were so many of the women who were dragged in, why did those voices grate? Clearly many of the women who were accused were women who had just made themselves difficult because they had driven a hard bargain, or they had pursued litigation, or they had done other unfemale things. And also it just is it was such a seminal kind of locked room mystery in history, and I just thought that we go back to it over and over. It has such resonance, and we can't seem to understand how it could have happened. And my feeling was that if you could actually get in the minds of these people, if you could begin to understand what New England felt like, what the stresses on their lives were, how fearful they were. They're living on the edge of a frontier, really between two Indian wars, and they feel themselves to be utterly under siege. If you could explain that terror and put it on the page, this would all begin to make a little bit more sense.
And nobody does it more beautifully than Stacy Schiff. Please join me in thanking Stacy.